Hello, everyone, and welcome to this hands-on line learning session. I'm Aileen Rizzo, Associate Director at the AIMS Center, and I'm here with my colleague, Scott. We'll wave hello.
Hello, everybody.
At the AIMS Center, we're committed to working toward a more equitable world through math and science education. And you can learn more about our work at our website, aimscenter.org. We would love to hear from you today by communicating with us through the chat feature. Make sure that your chat is set to panelists and attendees. That will help you see what everyone is saying and be able to communicate with everyone as well, including us. And we're going to start off with just letting you maybe share in the chat something about yourself, perhaps where you're from, what you teach, what you're interested in, why you're joining us today. And feel free to add comments throughout the presentation. All right, so today we're excited about diving into some weaving. So Scott, will you tell us a little bit more about what we're doing today? And I know you have a little bit of background you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Warm afternoon in the Central Valley of California. And yeah, today we're going to be experimenting with paper weaving. And of course, weaving in general goes back thousands of years in human history, and it's found in every culture. Just about as long as there have been human societies leaving artifacts, there have been examples of weaving. And up until the Industrial Revolution, weaving was part of everyday life for most people to make clothes and baskets and other kind of materials. And even if a family in a town didn't directly do their own weaving, all people would know where the local weaver was, or at least where the weaving loom was in a town. It was such a common profession in European towns that just like the names Smith and Cooper and Baker and Barber indicate family professions, weaver also became a name that emerged. And of course, weaving is still practiced by hand all around the world today. Many cultures hold on to their craft and their heritage by continuing with traditional weaving techniques all around the world. And I'm sure that some simple paper weaving is something we probably all did in preschool or kindergarten. And maybe some of you even still do this with your students today. But for just a little bit more history, we need to talk about our friend Frederick Froebel. He's the man from Germany that in the 1800s developed the idea of a kindergarten for children. He started this children's garden, and it caught on, and it led to the birth of American kindergarten. And if you've heard us at AIMS, if you've been around AIMS at all very long, you know that we love Frederick Froebel and we talk about him a lot. And you know that he gave children a series of gifts and he led them through some hands-on experiences with them. But he also developed a series of activities called occupations. Now, the blocks that we play with a lot are gifts, and the difference between a gift and an occupation is that gifts can retake their original form when they're done being used, but occupations change the form once they've been manipulated and they can't be returned to their original shape. So blocks are a gift because you can play with them and make designs with them, but they can be put back in their original box and they're still just wooden blocks. However, occupations like cutting paper transform the material, or maybe molding clay would be an occupation, because once the material is changed, it can't be returned to its original form. So today's activity comes from a Froebel occupation of paper weaving. And I'd actually like to start by showing you some examples of what kindergarten teachers would produce during their training as teachers. And so on the screen, you're seeing some examples of books that were made by what Froebel called kindergartners. Now, he didn't call the students kindergartners, he actually called the teachers kindergartners. So these are actually teacher books that they would go in their college training and make. And the first thing I want to do is invite you into the chat and just answer two of my favorite questions, which is, as you look at these paper weaving books done by kindergarten trainees for teachers, what do you notice and what do you wonder? So what do you notice about these books and what do you wonder about these books? And you can just throw your response in the chat, or if you really want to, if you want to unmute your mic and just call out, that would be fine too. And we'll keep an eye on the chat here. What do you notice and what do you wonder? Yeah, how long did it take just to make one, let alone a whole book full? Or how long did it take to make the whole book? Yeah, lots of patterns. Yeah, symmetry and how complicated the patterns are. Ooh, a theme. Is there a theme in there? That's a great question. Keep looking. Maybe you can find a theme. And how do we count? Is there some pre-planning done, or is it all done figuratively, mentally in the brain, and then just woven in? I noticed different colors. Yeah, different colors. Yeah. I noticed that some of the pages have more than two colors. There's red and green and yellow or orange and white all on one. Yeah, very much like a quilt. So what we're going to do today is very similar, although much more basic than what Froebel had his kindergarten teacher trainees do.
I think it's really interesting to see this collection, almost like a portfolio of work. And it's really great. It also feels like journal in a way of the different patterns, the different techniques, maybe the different colors. So I really am sure that maybe many of these teachers went back and reflected on how they created it, what they could do different next time. I think we do that in writing, but this is more in the texture and art side of probably that way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we move on today to to actually getting into this, doing the activity, because this is hands-on line, so we want to not just talk about it, we want to actually see what it is like to do it. We need to talk about the materials, because I think that's always a question, like how did they do it? What did they use to do paper weaving with? So Scott, can you take us through the materials, maybe some of the variety of materials we might use in embarking in paper weaving?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, we don't need a lot of materials. You can really do this with nothing more than a few sheets of paper and some scissors. But some things that help, that make the patterns a little bit more intricate or a little bit more precise. First of all, it helps if the paper is different colors. I'm just going to be using some construction paper that I bought, the cheapest construction paper I could find on Amazon. You can do it with one color of paper if you wanted to, but of course the contrast makes things stand out. Some teachers have their students color a design on paper and then use a white sheet of paper. So really just different colors paper and some scissors. To be a little bit more precise, a ruler is really going to help. And then if you really want to go over the top, I have here kind of a razor blade, an X-Acto blade, X-Acto crafting knife. I also have a paper cutter, you know, the big kind of guillotine kind of style that I used on some of these. Some tape might help, and maybe a craft kind of cutting mat might help. But those are all really optional. Really, scissors and paper is all you really need. So we can be as precise or as complicated as we want to be.
And definitely, as you're watching today, if you want to ask any questions in the chat, as you think about not only embarking on this as a learner, but what it might be for you to be a teacher and allow maybe a group of students or virtually to engage in some paper weaving. You might have some questions on what that looks like. We had some questions around the types of paper, and I think Scott explained like maybe thicker paper might be better for younger ones, so it won't rip as easy for them. So there's a lot of maybe questions that you might have that we haven't thought of, so please share in the chat. You know, a lot of these materials have to do with exactness and precision, which is great to have. Actually one of the math practices, right. But Scott is also going to share how you can even be unprecise and get a little freedom in that precision piece and still get some beautiful works of art. So you can go either way, or you can experiment with that. So let's go ahead and get started, Scott, and see how we can start some paper weaving on our own.
Yeah, so the first thing to talk about is, with any kind of weaving is there's really two parts. One is called the warp, and that's the part that runs vertically up and down. And the other part is called the weft. And weft is kind of an older word that over time morphed into the word weave. That's where we get the word weave. So there's the warp and the weave, or the warp and the weft, and the weave is the horizontal part. And so as we start, keep in mind that we're going to be cutting paper into strips, and we're going to form those strips into the warp and the weave. The warp will run vertically, and the weave or the weft will run horizontally. So Aileen, talk to us a little bit about STEAM, and then we'll jump right in.
Yes, of course. So one of the things we always try to do in our hands-on sessions is to think about where we see STEAM. And not about a checkoff list, like I saw that, I saw this, but really about just noticing and being aware. And as teachers, you might have a certain purpose for an activity like this, and you want to bring out maybe the mathematics in it. Maybe you want to bring out the art in it. And maybe we always have like a certain personality that tends to see things through a certain lens. But as we're embarking on this as learners, think about where you see some science, some technology, and remembering that technology is about the tools that we use. Engineering, do you see engineering as we think about this as learners? Art, I think the art is kind of coming to the foreground already with a lot of the beautiful patterns and examples we've seen. And think about the mathematics. Is there mathematics happening here? Where do we notice that? Where do we see it? Where do we hear the vocabulary that may correspond to each of these pieces in the academics? So as we start doing it as learners, we'll have this lens of what it's like to think about each of these pieces. So we'll revisit this again, but just let's have that as part of our outlook. All right, so let's get started. I think Scott's going to go to his webcam and we'll start in the instructions.
All right, so I think you're probably seeing my webcam over here. And so here I have my supplies, and we're going to start just with a basic weave. This is kind of the checkerboard pattern. And we've all probably done this, like I said, but it's a great place to start, and then we can jump off from there. So I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to start with this piece of paper. So our first step is to just make some marks. And we're going to start by making the warp, the vertical lines. And I'm going to start just by taking a ruler and drawing a line across the top of my paper, about an inch from the top. There's nothing really precise about that. And you'll notice that I did this along the long edge of the paper. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go along and I'm going to mark 1 inch, little 1 inch hash marks or tick marks along that line. And then I'm going to slide my ruler down all the way to the bottom of the paper. And I don't need a line at the bottom. I'm actually going to cut just all the way off the end of the paper. But I do need those tick marks to ensure that I get straight lines. And now I'm going to take my ruler. I'm just going to connect those tick marks so I have some vertical lines along here. So I'm going to do that all the way across. Rather than have you try to watch me draw lines, it should look like this when we're done. Doing my my Martha Stewart cooking show imitation. Hey, I just happened to have one done right here. And if at any point we're going a little too fast, just throw something in the chat or holler out and we can slow down a little bit. We've got a lot of fun to have and only about an hour, so we want to at least get started on a few of these. Now, we want to cut along those lines. So we're going to cut from the bottom up to the top, and we're going to stop at the top here. Now, two ways we can do this. One way is to just cut with scissors. And I have found that when I cut with scissors, I'm not precise enough, especially if I get in a hurry. And sometimes I'll leave little teeth in there because I'm not cutting perfectly straight. And then the weave papers sometimes get caught on there. So I'm going to take my X-Acto knife and I'm just going to run it down that line with a ruler so that I have a nice precise cut. You can do that however you want to do that. And this is where my little crafting mat comes in handy because now I'm not ruining our family craft table. So just cut across each one of those lines. And again, when we're done with that step, we should have something that looks like this. So it's kind of like a comb or a brush. You'll notice when I did this earlier, my blade caught a little bit and I tore my paper a little bit, but that's okay. Okay, so I got a message to slow down. So we'll slow down a little bit here. Thank you for your input. While we're slowing down here and waiting just a moment, I should say there's absolutely nothing magical about 1-inch measurements. I just happen to have paper that is 12 inches across, and so it divides nicely by 1 inch. The more closely you draw lines together, the more intricate weaving patterns you can do. So maybe even think about those kindergartners' portfolio weaving books. Those look like there were some pretty intricate patterns. I bet they cut their warp pieces pretty close together. I've done a few of these with some varying widths, and I have noticed, and it might just be because I bought such inexpensive paper, that the narrower I got, the more easily the paper tore, and it was really hard to get those intricate pieces. So if you want to do this 1/2 inch apart or 2 inches apart, it doesn't really matter. There's nothing magical about 1 inch. All right. How about if somebody in the chat just throws up a comment like, hey, okay, we're ready now. Okay, good. Okay, so I got a couple people who have said they are ready. Now, the next thing we want to do is we have our warp made now. Now we need to take another piece of paper, and this is going to be our weave. And so we're going to just, we can take a ruler and notice that these lines are going to go the other way. So previously my strips for the warp ran along the short edge of the paper. So it's going across the short dimension of the paper if you're using a rectangular page. My weave pages, or my weave strips, need to go the other direction. So these are going to go along the long dimension of the rectangle. So I've just marked off 1-inch strips here and marked them with my pen. And then if I cut those, I would end up with a lot of strips of paper. And so again, I'll let you not have to watch me do that, but you go ahead and do that. So I've got my warp made and I've got my weave strips ready. These also I just did at 1 inch, just because that's what I did on the other page. But again, there's nothing magic about 1 inch.
Hey, Scott, while everyone's doing some cutting, I know that there are some resources on the one pager that we created, and one of them is this book. So maybe while you're cutting, I could just show this book here.
Yeah, nice.
The Rainbow Weaver is a bilingual book in English and Spanish, and it talks about a little girl who is whose mom is weaving, and she wants to be a weaver too. And like a lot of children, sometimes we tell them you're too young or you can't do this yet. And the weaving that her mom is doing is to make money for her school supplies. So it's a really great story about the Mayan women in Guatemala and how they use weaving in what they sell at the markets to earn money, but also has some environmental pieces here because she experiments with different materials in her weaving process. Nice. And I think it's a great children's story to read part or to read all of it with the child, maybe to get into that cultural aspect of how weaving is in so many cultures, but also how young children can be weavers too and makers too. So this is the link to this is in the resource page that we'll share at the end, but you could also, get a book for yourself. I think this is a great story to have in your library.
Nice, thank you, Eileen. And I put the name of that in the chat. I put the title of the book in the chat.
Great.
All right, so are we ready with some strips of paper? I think I'm going to move ahead unless I see somebody say, wait a minute. So we're going to take one strip and we're going to start weaving now back and forth. So I'm going to go, let's say today, I'm going to start on my right-hand side. It doesn't matter which side you start on. I'm going to go over the first warp and under the second one, and then over the third one and under the next. So I'm just going to keep this pattern up of going over and under and over and under, back and forth, all the way across. And as you feel the texture of doing this, is you can probably figure that, again, with younger fingers, thicker material probably works better. But as adults, we can just use this paper and have fun with it. Okay, now I'm going to take another strip and I'm going to do the exact same thing, but in the opposite pattern. So the first time I went over, I began by going over. This time I'm going to go under and then over. And then alternate back and forth all the way across. And you'll notice I'm not doing this right at the top, but once I get across, then I take and just shove it up to the top. Now, if you ever see a loom actually operating, and a loom is what people use to weave with thread or flax or other textile materials, I've always been intrigued that there's a wooden bar that kind of goes across that carries the thread, and then there's another bar that slams up vertically. And all that's doing is exactly what I just did, is just pushing the thread up to the top so that the weave stays nice and tight. And then we're just going to keep taking these papers and going back and forth, alternating the pattern. Oops, I didn't alternate that one the right way. And the nice thing about this, it's easy just to pull it out and redo it. Now, some people, when they do this, they don't cut all the way to the bottom. They might just cut a slit in the middle and leave the bottom attached. I kind of find it a little easier to cut all the way down. But that's another variation that you could try, depending on maybe age of the children you're working with. And so as we get a few of those weaves in the warp, you'll notice this checkerboard pattern already emerging. Now, another thing that sometimes is helpful is taking some tape, and I just happen to have some blue tape. You could use Scotch tape or any kind of tape. And if you just take a piece of tape and put it somewhere here on the, and I'm actually weaving on the back, then those will stay in place, and they can tend to move around a little bit as you get farther down in the weave pattern. And then, of course, when we turn this over, then we have our nice checkerboard pattern. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little 5-minute play break. And we're just going to turn you loose. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to continue working on that checkerboard pattern. And then we'll come back together and we'll talk about some variations. So I'm going to set a timer here for 5 minutes. And Chris may or may not start some music. And then in 5 minutes, we'll come back together. All right, so keep going on that checkerboard. Carolyn, thanks for joining in for a little bit. Glad to have you here. Recording of this will be online on our website, so you can always tune in later. But thanks for joining for a while. We might say also, while you're doing this, that we would love to see any pictures of any weaving that you do. You could put that on our Facebook page. And I know, Chris, I might have gone a little out of order, but if you want to show that slide that has the links to different places where people could show some pictures. There we go. So either email them to us on the website or on, is that Instagram? I'm not a social media guy, so I don't know all my logos. But there's some links for you if you want to show us some pictures of what you've been doing. We got about 2.5 minutes left. Hey, and look at that. All of a sudden my checkerboard pattern's done. If we're going a little fast, if you don't have quite the time to finish the checkerboard pattern, finish it up later. But once you get that pattern started, it's easy to kind of continue that or follow along or experiment with some other things. So a little bit, about a minute left, and then we're going to come back together. And even as this last 30 seconds or so ticks down, let me ask a question and maybe just get you thinking a little bit. What are some things we could change, even just with a basic checkerboard pattern? There's always lots of variables. So what could be changed to alter this checkerboard pattern? And somebody said, once you get into the rhythm, it's such a soothing process. Absolutely right. I've had a great time just practicing weaving, and boy, sometimes I'll put on some music and before I know it, an hour has gone by, or I'll listen to a podcast or something, and it's just a really relaxing thing to do, to weave some paper and come up with some designs. So if you have an idea, go ahead and throw it in the chat. What are some things we could change that would alter the way this checkerboard pattern looks? I've already kind of hinted at one of them by altering the width of the strips. So Laura says, using printed wrapping paper. Absolutely. So changing the material that we use could change the way it looks. Ooh, cut diagonally. Yeah. Different colors. Yeah. One of the kindergartners, one of the Froebel models had more than 2 colors. What if we use fewer colors? What if the weave was all one color? That could be an interesting look. Any other ideas? So changing the width, changing the colors. What about not just going over and under, over and under? What if we change the pattern? What if you went over, over, under, over, over, under? I actually have an example of something like that here. So this is just changing the back and forth nature of the weave. You can play around with that a little bit. And then how about if we didn't cut in straight lines? What if we didn't use just perfectly linear cuts? In fact, Aileen alluded to a little bit ago, I was going to show an example of what if you have real little guys, students, that can't cut straight? Well, I kind of wanted to see what would happen if I did that. And so I'm right-handed and I did some cutting with my left hand, and it was really rough. I do not have that kind of motor control with my left hand. But this is what came out. And I still think this looks really cool. So even with non-linear cuts and lines, we can still get a real neat checkerboard design pattern from any age student. And then you could even expand that out. What if you had some kind of intentional curved cutting instead of just accidental or found curved cutting? So those are some different things that we could vary. And what we want to do next is actually just break out again and let you experiment. Hopefully you have some more paper. And I want you to experiment with that a little bit. Change the width of the strips, change the pattern that you weave, change the kind of lines that you cut, and make some different changes, make some variables, add some different colors in, and see what you come up with. And we're gonna make a 10-minute break this time. However, at the same time, there is a certain pattern that every time I show people, they really get excited about it. And that is, it's kind of a three-dimensional illusion. And there it is on the screen there. And so in these 10 minutes, if you would like to just play around and make some variations on your own, please do. Be way more creative than I am. But if you would like to learn how to do that particular design that kind of looks like a three-dimensional cube, then I'll lead you through that as we go. So I'm going to set my timer again for 10 minutes, and we will start. So again, free play time, change the variables you want to change, or follow along and I'll show you how to make the 3D shape. Okay. So to make the 3D shape, here's the first thing to do. Take a piece of paper, and this time we're going to have it running vertically, up and down. I guess that's what, portrait mode? I'm going to first make a fold, take the bottom and take it right up to the top and make a fold. So now we have a shorter rectangle. I'm going to leave this crease on the bottom. Okay, so I did a fold and the crease is now on the bottom of my rectangle. Now I'm going to take my ruler and again, just like the first one, I'm going to make a line about 1 inch away from the top. I'm just eyeballing that. There's nothing magical about that measurement. Now I want to find the middle of this line. Well, I know in my case, this paper is 9 inches across, so the middle of that would be 4.5. So I'm going to mark, put a little tick mark there at 4.5 inches. Then I'm going to come right down to the bottom and duplicate that mark. So 4.5 inches across. I'm going to put a mark again. Need to make sure I did that right. Yep, 4.5. Now, from that top mark on the top line here, I'm now going to put 3 marks off to the right that are 1/2 inch apart. So from this mark, 1/2 inch, then another 1/2 inch, then another 1/2 inch. So 3 off to the right. So here's my center mark, and then 3 off to the right, 1/2 inch each. Then I'm going to do the same thing going the other way. 1, 2, and 3, 1/2 inch apart, away from the middle on the left. I'm going to come down to the bottom, and from my middle mark, I'm going to put 3 marks again, but this time I'm going to spread them out a little more. I'm going to make them 1 inch apart. So 1, 2, 3, each 1 inch apart. And do the same thing on the left. And so when we connect those lines, which would be the next step, we should have something that looks like this. So now instead of just straight vertical lines, now we have kind of they fan out a little bit. So I'll give you just a second to do that if you're following along with me. I hope some of you are, but I hope some of you are just experimenting on your own, trying some different kind of things. Now, of course, we're going to take and cut these lines. This time, though, we need to cut through both layers. Since we have a folded paper, we need to cut through both layers of the paper. So I'm going to cut each of those. And when we get done with that, it should look like this. So again, we have that comb that we had before, but now it's not, the lines are not parallel. And now when I unfold this paper, first thing I notice is that both the top and the bottom are joined. I didn't cut all the way off the ends, but also they're not parallel, but also they change direction in the middle. So now we have, it's expanded in the middle and closer on the ends. Now what I like to do is I like to flip this over and weave from the back of the paper. And I'm going to use some black strips this time. Now you might have strips left over from your first cut, but take a second piece of paper and mark off some strips. They can be 1 inch, they can be shorter than 1 inch, they can be bigger than 1 inch, it doesn't matter. What does matter is, again, my warp now is going along the long edge of the rectangular paper. So my horizontal strips, my weave strips, should coincide with the short dimension of the rectangle. And we're simply going to weave that checkerboard pattern again with one little difference. I'm not going to start at the top. I'm going to start in the middle. And so I'm going to start going over and under and over and under and over and under. And now what I'm going to do is I want the edge of this strip to perfectly line up with that crease. Now to keep that in place, because if I start weaving again, it's going to move around. To keep that in place, I'm going to take just a small little corner of tape and tape that down. And since this is the back of the design, I don't particularly care if there's tape on it. And now I'm going to do the other middle piece in the opposite pattern. So going over and over, over and under, but opposite of the first one. And now I want that also to butt right up against that center crease. And I want to tape that down. Wow, we've already only got 2.5 minutes left. Yeah, so Chris just put in the chat, if you miss any part of this and want to watch some recording of it, it will be on the website and the link is there. So you can see where this is going. Now we're just going to work our way out from the center, alternating the patterns. And when it's done, it'll look something like this. So you'll see I've woven. I'm not sure what the past tense of that is. I've done the weaving of all these strips and taped them all down. And the only last step to really make this three-dimensional shape look really cool is when we turn that over, there's kind of these extra strips hanging off here. I'm just going to take my X-Acto knife, my razor blade. Now I'm going to carefully cut along, well, that wasn't too careful. Cut those off so that it matches the edge of what our eyes tell us is a cube or a three-dimensional figure of some kind. And if I do that on the bottom, then we will be all done. So we only have about 30 seconds left in our 10-minute play break. I hope some of you have gotten some cool weaving patterns done. And I would find it very difficult for me to have done this in 10 minutes, but I just wanted to show you how to do that. There's our kind of three-dimensional shape.
It's great, Scott. Thank you for sharing that. I know when I first saw that design, I was like, how did he do that? And trying to problem solve and figure it out. And that could be part of the investigation and the experiment. And I wanted to show some things that I got to experiment with. So paper that has, like, I think someone said using wrapping paper. I used a paper that had like a gold square on it and just did like the regular checkerboard to see how that gold square would kind of produce a different color in the middle. And then Scott and I were talking about just reusing different things, like if you reuse newspaper or gift wrap. But then I remembered I bought some old books that had like art prints in them. So one of them had art sketches. So I took a sketch of a tree and then I wove just like really thin red paper in it. And then I did the opposite of what you did. I did like more of an hourglass cut in the middle.
Yeah,
and then I left those at the end because I kind of like the lines at the end.
Yeah.
So many ways that I hope you got to experiment today. And I hope we get to see some pictures. If you'll share them on social media and tag us, that'd be great. Because when we see others' work, we get inspired and we really get uplifted in coming around as a community and making things like this is so much fun. So part of, oh, and yes, there's a slide with our tags that we'd love for you to share. So part of what we talked about in the beginning was the STEAM, like where do we see the STEAM? And because my background is in mathematics and I was a math teacher, I always hear like parallel lines. I see the parallel lines. I think about the patterns that are happening. So I always tend to gravitate towards that. So then I have to be mindful, like where else am I seeing things like the art that's coming out? So people talked about using color. So maybe using different color schemes would be a great way to experiment, the contrast of colors as well. Engineering, I feel, really comes out when we start cutting in different ways and wanting different textures or trying to see, I wonder if this will happen. But that also has to do, I think, with a lot of science. Like we kind of make a prediction of what we think it'll look like when we're done or when we use a certain pattern. And then we can see if it really turned out that way or if it surprised us. I know Scott has so many examples that he's done with doing like writing with letters and different examples that we have, and hopefully we'll share a little bit more. But I hope you got to see some of that STEAM. If you'd like to put in the chat, maybe something that you noticed that you were surprised about, or some things that really came out to you in those areas, science, technology, engineering, arts, or mathematics. I hope you'll start thinking about that as a learner, and then how maybe you'll use that as a teacher. Definitely the NGS practices are coming out because we're asking questions. If we're problem solving and we want a certain design, how do we get there? How do we do that? Scott is giving us a plan. He's giving us some ways to start an investigation. It could be cooperative weaving with an adult and a young child, but it could be very complicated weaving on your own as an individual. You want to see a pattern come to life, or you want to just do an experiment with something. I love weaving because there's so many ways to enter into the activity, and then so many ways you can explore it and get deeper in your understanding and your knowledge. So Scott, I know you have some more applications, so I'll turn it over to you to share some of those.
Yeah, thanks. And Aileen, one of the things I noticed on the one that you shared with the gold square in the middle is there were some gaps in between the checkerboard pieces. And I'm just wondering if how you did that. Was that just not pushing the strips together closely? Like leaving some gap in between the strips?
Yeah, and I think also because my strips were a lot thinner, like I wasn't trying to go for a square. I
Oh,
have
yeah.
some of those
Okay.
as well.
So there's another
So
variable. That's awesome.
just changing different things and seeing what will happen and what I notice about that pattern.
Yeah. So I also like to think about how this activity might be used with all ages of students that we work with, and even different content areas. Really weaving is kind of a code, isn't it? And it really could be an introduction into coding. It could be, you could make a tie-in with computer graphics, because an LCD screen is really just a giant electronic weave on the wall. And if you know anything about pixels and pixel art, you're simply turning things on and turning things off. Weaving could be an introduction into binary numbers with ones and zeros and on and off. There's just so much different areas, so many different areas that you could jump into. And I'll even take one more thing that I'm really passionate about, which is, of course, music. And what in the world might weaving have to do with music? If you're at all familiar with the Google Music Lab, one of the little lab apps that they have here is called Songmaker. And when I went into that, I saw a warp and a weave. And if you start making, I always forget to do this. I want to share this again and make sure I'm actually sharing my sound. There we go. We could weave across this grid in lots of different ways. And there's even a rhythm track down here on the bottom. And when you hit play, and that's probably the world's worst song, but we could have so much fun. And how fun would it be for a kid to make a visual pattern and then see what does that pattern sound like if we play it as the code that we practiced with here. We can change the tempo, and we're literally making a song with weaving. So there you go. And I know I do a lot of work with digital recording and different sound production applications. And a lot of them are really just nothing more than complicated versions of this, where there's a bar that moves across from left to right, and it's just weaving sounds together, and it's an introduction into coding and all those things we were talking about. So just another idea of how to jump into weaving. And we want to end today in the last few minutes that we have with some examples of different weaving that people have done. I'm going to throw a link into the chat right now. And Aileen introduced me to this lady's work the other day. And she's done some amazing artistic work with paper weaving. This is nothing more than paper. So if you want to look at that link and just enjoy her work. Another thing is we can weave with things other than paper. Here's some weaving I did just playing around with wood. The one on the left, I was walking through the grocery store and saw a long, I think they were called marshmallow roasting sticks. They're just long wooden dowels. And I thought, hey, I'm going to take those home and weave with them a little bit. On the right is some more flexible wood that I did some weaving with a few years ago. And that was kind of fun. Another way to do some weaving is different kinds of paper. And so I don't know if any of you were in the bubble art webinar last time, but I took some of my bubble art and cut that up and did some weaving with that. And then I also have a collection of vinyl records, and some of them are unplayable because they're all so old and bad sounding. So I just took the vinyl record cover and saw that as cardboard, and I cut that up and did some weaving with that. And I thought that was kind of a cool kind of artistic thing to do. And then I think there's one more slide of just some examples. There's the example of the sketch that Aileen showed. And I think, Aileen, you made that heart on the right also. So our weaving doesn't have to be rectangular, does it? We can change the weave into all kinds of different shapes. So those are just some examples of once you get some weaving into your fingers, you can just spend a lifetime changing things and making different variations and have just a great time with it.
Definitely. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for sharing that with us. Also, we want to let you know that on our website are resources for all our hands online, including this one for you as a teacher to use to remember the materials you need, maybe some questions you could ask, some things you can notice during the activity, and also some other resources like books and other websites that give some additional resources to support you in your teaching and learning. We also wanted to remind you that we have a play shop that's coming up, Paper Imagineering. This one is geared toward early childhood educators, and we're hoping that you will register soon because today is the last day to register. So please register and join us for that time together where we can explore some more activities and curiosities around paper. The weaving that we did today is so rich and so much you could do, and paper is just a really rich material to learn with. So we hope that you will enjoy that session with us. And we wanted to also let you know that we have finished our spring series now for Hands Online, and our fall 2021 series will begin August 10th. So hopefully you can join now so you won't forget. And join our mailing list so we can send you updates around that and the topics that we'll be exploring in the fall. And of course, always visit our website, aimcenter.org, where you can stay up to date with what we're doing, the work we're doing, and stay connected with us. And we're all learners in this community together, and we hope that we can learn together and explore together. So thank you again for joining us, and we want to wish you a great rest of the week. And everyone take care. Thank you again, Scott, for this amazing activity and all the work you put into preparing that for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks for playing along.
Bye, everyone.